Alright, so I was ready to go to bed, and literally every single YouTuber just dropped their GH6 video reveals, so I was like, damn, alright, I gotta watch all these videos, and I pretty much watched like almost all of them, so I'm just gonna be going over a list of good and the bad things about these cameras. You know, if you actually want, first-hand experience with these cameras, watch their videos. I'm a fraud, I'm not a real YouTuber. I got like 500 subscribers, so Panasonic obviously didn't send me one, but I have a list. So they might have their own experiences, but you know what they say. You know, a smart man learns from his own mistakes, but a really, really smart man learns from other people's mistakes. So I watched everyone's videos and I figured out the stuff that's good about the camera and bad about the camera. And so we're gonna start out with the good though. We're gonna start out positive before I, just rain on everyone's parade and talk shit about the camera. First of all, the good. The IBIS is amazing of this camera, which obviously it's gonna have it, because I remember when I had the GH5, like the IBIS of that camera was like insane. It had like a tripod mode on it where you could pretty much just handhold the camera and just made it look like it was on a tripod. So the IBIS is even better on this camera. It's like 7.5 stops or something, so that's really good. But I believe it's also 7.5 stops on the new Olympus or OM Systems OM1 cameras, so it should be identical to that, but I would have to get both of those cameras and test them out to really see. But another good thing about the IBIS of the camera is that it can use that IBIS to do now 100 megapixel handheld shots, which is really amazing. But again, it only works on like really still subjects, so even if you're doing something like landscape, it might work some of the time. Like for example, if you're taking like a picture of like a beautiful forest and you try to do the handheld shot, just from the wind moving and like the trees, leaves rattling and everything, that might mess it up. But the fact that it can just do that handheld is quite amazing. And with the Olympus OM1, I believe it can only do 50 megapixels, and then if you want to go up to 85 megapixels, you actually have to put the camera on a tripod. So this camera can surpass that and give you sharper results. But from what I've seen, it just gives you a little bit of a sharpness boost compared to what you get original out of it. So even though it does advertise it as 100 megapixel, it seems more like it gives you results more similar to like a 40 to 50 megapixel, I would say. Because when I watched the Three Elephants and a Blind Man's video, he compared to the Z9 and it was slightly sharper than that, and the Z9 is a 45 megapixel camera. So even though they're advertising 100 megapixels, it seems more like it's like 50 megapixels. But it might change on how still you hold it. Maybe if you put it on a tripod, it'll be even sharper. But that's what it seems like. There's another cool feature with the cameras that you can record out of the USB-C port. So you can connect the camera directly to an SSD drive. So you can buy yourself a terabyte or 2 terabyte SSD drive and just record directly into that. I don't think they revealed yet what codecs or whatever you can record on it, but the fact that it can do that is quite amazing, because SSDs are a lot cheaper to buy than if you were to buy CF Express Type B cards that are like a terabyte or 2. So it's cool that it can do that. And also with the SSD drives, if you record into that, you can just plug it into your computer and then just directly edit off of it. So that's really cool. The camera has pretty much zero rolling shutter, which is cool. So if you're doing any shots of, if you're tracking like a train, or if you're driving on a car and you're like recording fences or whatever, you don't see any rolling shutter, which is cool. The camera has a lot of options in recording. Like I think I had like 50 or like 80 different options when you're recording different codecs. So it can do a lot of different stuff. You can do, completely, uncompressed stuff. Like you can do like ProRes, so you can do like 1,000 megabits per second, which is so ridiculous. I don't know why anyone would torture themselves with that. Or you can shoot at the, smaller compressed files, which is cool. And you can even do ProRes externally through the HDMI port, so that's really cool. So you can get yourself like a Ninja V or something and be able to shoot out of that. Also, the camera sensor is 4x3, and because of that, you can use the full width of the camera to do anamorphic footage, which is really cool. A really cool thing about this camera that I do love, that which Sony cameras had, is that you can apply your own LUTs to the camera. Like right now as I'm recording it, it just has a like a built-in Rec 709 type of LUT, which is fine. You know, it lets you see what your footage is pretty much gonna look like when you edit it normally. But it's cool to be able to put LUTs on your camera so that, you know, when you're recording, you can go for like a different artistic look and then see what that's gonna look like, you know, when you're recording. So I wish more cameras had that, but this camera does, so that's really cool. The camera has a really cool new function called dynamic range boost, which pretty much records from two different ISO points, I believe 800 and 2000. So you have to record at ISO 2000 in order to be able to do this, which is really cool. I'm going to talk about the problems with that later, but it's cool that you can get a lot more dynamic range by using that function. But again, there's a little bit of problems with the dynamic range boost that I'll get into. The image quality is great out of the camera. When you shoot at the 5.7 resolution out of this camera, the image quality looks really good. Like, it's really good. The colors look really great. They seem to improve their color science a lot, so that I'm really happy with. The camera has a tally light, so when you're recording yourself, you can actually see that the camera is recording. That's the thing that you don't really think about, but like, you know, when you work in video production, there's so many times where you think you're recording and then you just check and it's like, oh, I wasn't recording this entire time. So that's something really cool. Also, this camera has a tilt up and a flip out screen, so it's one of those screens that you can actually like tilt it up and also you're able to flip it out. It allows you to tilt up the screen and then turn it so that if you have, you know, stuff attached to the side of your camera, then you can, you know, easily be able to do that without the things getting in the way. So that's really cool. But that's pretty much all the goods I have listed that I like. Let's talk about the bad stuff. First of all, we're going to start up the autofocus. The autofocus is still the contrast detect bullshit that no one likes. For some reason, they insist on using it. According to one of the YouTubers I've watched, I think it was Gerald Ondan, I'm not too sure. But apparently they've been working on this camera like even before the GH5 was released. So back then they didn't know people wanted phase detect. So because of that reason, they just never end up doing it. But it's like, you know, that's like the one thing. Like, honestly, if this camera had phase detect autofocus and it actually worked really well, then I would recommend this camera to everyone. Like, the camera would sell really well. I would say like more than double, triple the amount of camera sales you would get out of this camera if it just had phase detect autofocus, because then it would be like one of the first cameras that are like a, you know, like almost like a fully functioning like cinema camera that has really good autofocus. That doesn't really exist right now, and I feel like that's a big gap in the market because these autofocusing systems are getting so good that you don't even need like a focus puller. Like, I can just like with the A7 IV I'm recording, like the autofocus just works perfectly. It's to the point where I'm like, you know what, I don't want to use a camera where I have to manual focus because the autofocus just works perfectly fine. And the thing is that the autofocus works decently fine. First of all, like for like talking head videos and stuff, like it might work. It just depends on what your background is. Like, for example, I turn these lights on because of this reason, because as you can see, I just have a bunch of bokeh balls behind me. If I had contrast based detection autofocus on this camera, then those would be constantly growing bigger and smaller. And it's also very distracting because it's just, I would never use it in a professional project because it just like, you can see that if you look at a person that was shot in contrast based autofocus, you can see the person constantly becoming, you know, autofocus and focus, autofocus and focus. That's how contrast detect works. It just, you know, constantly haunts to make sure it's in focus, and it just doesn't work well. So personally, just because of the autofocus reasons, this is a camera I would never buy. Also, this camera has a bunch of great slow motion features that you can do like 1080p up to 300 frames per second. But if you're using that to like, I don't know, like track something, maybe you're trying to track like a bird flying in the air or someone's doing like a backflip or something, for those like fast-paced scenarios, like you need good autofocus for that. But this camera just doesn't have it. So it's like cool, you have these cool autofocus features, but you're gonna have to use manual focus in order to do that. So I don't know, I feel like it kind of counters the whole like slow motion reasoning, you know. So let's get into the dynamic range boost problem, which is that first of all you have to be at ISO 2000, which means that a lot of times you might need to use an ND filter in order to be able to do that. So that's another thing you have to bring with you, which is very annoying. And since you're at the 2000 ISO, your image does become noisier, especially since you're shooting at a Micro Four Thirds camera. 2000 ISO is pretty noisy, so you might need to do some like denoising and post-production in order to get rid of that, but I don't know. I think more testing needs to be done on that. But from what I see, dynamic range boost does give you a significant amount of noise in your image. Also, there's no internal ND filters with this camera, which I wish this camera had that. But I get that, like, for some reason they can't have an internal ND filter and also a working IBIS at the same time for some reason. I mean, I think if they just made the camera a little bit bigger and just put it like in front of it, like, I feel like it should work, but for some reason they're not able to do that. But I feel like if they had that like dynamic range boost and you had the internal ND filters, those two would work really well together, but unfortunately it doesn't have that. Oh my god, I'm gonna take this off. It's like getting hot in here. This one might not be true. Like, this is just from like the videos I've seen. But the 1080p on the camera just doesn't look that good to me. Like, a lot of the footages that I've seen kind of look like over sharp on 1080p. Now, I could be completely wrong. I just haven't seen that many people, you know, test the 1080p that much because everyone was kind of focusing on the 5.7K out of the camera. But from the 1080p slow motion footage I've seen, like, it didn't look that good. Maybe it's just because I was seeing it side by side with the 5.7K footage, so it just, you know, played a trick in my head. But this 1080p didn't look that good, and 1080p in my opinion is a lot more important than 5.7K. Because if you're a working videographer, I mean, depending on what you shoot, I guess, but a lot of times I mainly shoot in 1080p resolution. I think people look better in 1080p. It takes up less space. It's easier to edit. It's just an easier workflow to work with 1080p footage than work with 6K ProRes footage that's like a gigabyte per second. Like, I think that stuff is so ridiculous. Even if you're like shooting like a movie or something, if you're shooting like a big budget feature like movie, then you might use that. But even if I'm like shooting a short film or something, like that stuff just seems like so wasteful and unreasonable. But again, the 1080p, I could be completely wrong. The 1080p might be completely fine on the camera. Just from like little clips I've seen, the 1080p just looked a little over sharpened, like that cheap 1080p look. So that's something to just keep an eye out for. Like, I'm not 100% sure on that. The dynamic range, even with the dynamic range boost, is not as good as the full frame camera. So it's a step up from other Micro Four Thirds cameras, but it's just still under that, you know, level of full frame cameras. And this is another thing that I feel like might be a problem, but they're saying it's not, which is the weather sealing on the camera. Now, there's open vents on the camera for the fan to, you know, blow air into it. And they're saying the camera is still the same, you know, splash, dust proof or whatever. But you have an open vent on the camera and a fan inside. Like, I feel like it has to affect the weather sealing somehow. So, I mean, it might not or anything, but I don't know, with the OM1 coming out and that camera having like perfect, you know, weather sealing on it, I feel like this camera might have some weather sealing problems. Like, if you just like dunk that camera in water, the OM1 would be fine, but the GH6 probably won't survive that. Alright, so what are my final thoughts? For photographers, I don't think this camera is good at all, to be honest with you guys. Like, the 100 megapixel, you know, handheld, you know, pixel joint connection thing is cool and all, but how, in what realistic scenario are you really going to be able to use that? You know, the thing I do mainly is photograph people. People move, you can't use that. If you want to take a picture of your dog, you can't use it. If you want to shoot a landscape, then maybe you can use it if there isn't any wind going around. I mean, I guess it's good for like, if you want to do like product photography, or if you want to like reserve art, or any of those scenarios where you're, you know, taking a picture of something that's completely static. Maybe if you're doing like macro work of like bugs or something, where you have a dead bug that you have like taking a macro picture of. Then for stuff like that, there's scenarios where it's like really cool, and for those scenarios I think it works really, and for those scenarios I think it'll be really cool. So it's cool for some small niche audience, but I think for most people, I don't think the photography part is going to be really useful that much, especially since the autofocus doesn't seem that good on the camera either when it comes to photography. So because of those reasons, I wouldn't really recommend this camera for photography, especially with the OM1 coming out. That's probably going to be a better photography camera. When it comes to videography, that's where it gets really confusing, because on one hand, it's a really good camera. Like, if you get this camera, you're gonna be able to take, you know, beautiful images. You're gonna be able to shoot in, you know, 6K resolution, have your videos look great and everything. But at the same time, there's just so many great options out there for the same price. Again, we have the camera like this here. This is the A7 IV by Sony, which is a full frame camera that has amazing lenses for it, and the camera has probably the best autofocus in the world right now, and you can get really great looking images out of this camera also. And things that will the image quality out of the GH6 look better than the A7 IV? Maybe, but it's like at the same time, just light your scene well, say your white balance correctly, and you'll have a good looking image no matter which camera you use. But the advantage the A7 IV will have is that it'll keep your subject in focus. Well, if you use GH6, you have to manual focus, and you might miss focus, and you might mess up here and there. But the A7 IV's autofocus is pretty much foolproof. It just works perfectly fine all the time. So it's like, I don't know. It just feels like at that price point, there's just better cameras out there that make a lot more sense. And if you're someone that's like, you know what, I'm just gonna manual focus, I don't need autofocus, then I would just recommend the Blackmagic Pocket 6K Pro. That's a $2,500 camera. It's around the same price. I know the GH6 is $2,200, so it's a little bit cheaper. But if you're spending that much money, you might as well get the Blackmagic Pocket 6K, because you're going to be able to shoot raw out of that camera, straight out of the camera, and it has internal ND filters, which I think for cinematography is such a huge time saver. And also Blackmagic, if you use DaVinci Resolve to color correct your footage, Blackmagic files just edit beautifully on that camera. So I don't know. I feel like there's just better cameras out there for that price point. But one thing that GH6 will have advantage over the A7 IV or the Blackmagic Pocket 6K Pro is going to be the IBIS out of that camera, just straight out of camera. Like, you can get like almost gimbal-like looking images out of that camera. So that is a huge advantage. And also you're going to be using smaller, lighter lenses with that camera, because I'm putting quotes on it because there's a lot of, if you look at like Panasonic's new Pro lenses, they're like these it's a 20 to 50 millimeter 1.7 and a 50 to 100 millimeter 1.7 lenses. Both those lenses are very large and heavy, so it's kind of, both those lenses are very large and heavy, and so is the GH6. It's like 2 pounds. So even though it's a Micro Four Thirds camera, like a full frame weight and size, so it's kind of kills the point of the Micro Four Thirds cameras, honestly. But things that it gives you a lot of options, and I feel like the camera kind of plays a lot of niches, like if you want to shoot anamorphic and stuff. So if you kind of fall into those niches, the camera does make sense. But I feel like for most people, it just doesn't really make sense to buy that camera. And the camera like all-in-one makes a lot more sense for Micro Four Thirds, because I feel like that camera focuses more on the strengths of the Micro Four Thirds. But anyways, that was my last video. But anyways, guys, hope this video helped you or whatever. I don't know. I'm just tired. I should go to bed. I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.